Before I start today's tutorial, I have an announcement. I have a new Skillshare class out. It's basically another version of this autumn leaf doodle tutorial with more elements though, like mushrooms, snails, and of course the autumn leaves, and this time it's painted with watercolors and colored pencils. In this class, I'll be demonstrating from the planning process, sketching right to painting, and of course adding the details and textures with colored pencils, then finished off with some optional gold shimmers. I just thought that this would be a fun doodle that you can paint with ease, but you can take the detail as far as you'd like, and it's open to different styles as well. Like usual though, if you don't want to draw, you can also download the outline from the projects and resources section on Skillshare. If you're interested, I'd love for you to join me in this class, and if you've never been a member on Skillshare, you can go to the link in my description box for a free trial where you can have access to all the classes on Skillshare, including mine. Hope to see you guys there, and let's get this tutorial going. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to be doodling some autumn leaves with gouache and colored pencils, so let's get right into it. Let's begin by sketching it out. I'm going to start with a maple leaf right in the middle of the page, and I'm going to make the pointy edges rounded to make the leaf shape look a bit cuter. For the next leaf, I'm thinking along the lines of an oak leaf, which is long and narrow with lobe tips on the opposite sides. I'm also going to play around with the frills on either side. You can make them as detailed or as simple as you'd like. So for an example, for this next one, I'm adding less frills on either side so it looks slightly different. As for this next one, I'm drawing normal leaves growing on either side of a long stem, and basically what I'm trying to do is to add more leaves in different shapes, framing the first maple leaf, and I'm going to build the composition outwards. You can play around by creating your own leaf shapes. You can make circular leaves or teardrop shaped ones like the one here. Some ideas you can play around with is the length of the leaves or whether the leaves are more narrow or wide, and also how they're grouped together, if they're going to be single leaves or bunched together. As you can see, I also added some dried flowers. I love hydrangea, so I decided to add some single 4-petaled flowers with diamond-shaped petals, which I also find will be some nice additional fillers to the composition. Here I'm drawing out a single large leaf with some pointy edges to make it look a bit more interesting, and I've also rounded the edges. And here's a narrow type of leaf again, but I made the width on either side more even than the ones before. There's still a bit of space on the bottom right area here, so I decided to add a group of berries growing out of a branch with some additional leaves to fill in the space. And here I'm going to add more teardrop leaves, but I'm going to make them longer and more narrow compared to the one on the left, just to make them a bit different. For this doodle, I'll be using my Himi gouache. The first color here is ochre, earth yellow, medium yellow, Ponceau, Prussian Blue, Jade Green, and white. I'll also be using my watercolor colored pencils by Faber Castell. This is just a hobby grade. They don't have names for their colors, instead they have numbers. So here are the numbers in case you have the exact same set and you want to use these colors as well. Before I paint, I want to take a bit of each color and place them on my palette with a bit of paper to keep them wet. This way I can store the rest of the paint away so they don't dry up. You actually need way less paint than what I have on my palette here, but I'm not as experienced with gouache, so I'm still pretty bad at estimating how much paint I need. So if you're going to paint the same way, you can take less than this amount so you don't have to waste as much paint. So once I have all my colors, I'm going to make my first color mixture, which is from ochre, white, and medium yellow. I accidentally took too much white here, so I'm just going to add a bit more of the ochre. And I'm still going to keep the colors separate but near each other so I have easy access to mix the colors together whenever I need to. I also like to play around with the ratio here. So as you can see, I started with the dominant color being ochre, and then I added a bit more medium yellow as I get towards the bottom. And on the left side here, I decided to add Ponceau to the medium yellow to create an orange color. And this is basically what I'm going to do as I paint all of the leaves. By adding different color mixtures to one single leaf, I find that it makes the composition look a bit more colorful and interesting. Since this is the first leaf, I also added a lot of different colors. Here on the right, I decided to add a bit of Prussian blue into the ochre just to see what the color will look like. And the thing is, with gouache, you can always pile on more colors on top if you don't like the previous color that you put on, which is what I'm going to do here since I find that there's a bit too much contrast with the Prussian blue mixed into the color. And I was basically using this first leaf as a slight experimentation with my color mixtures. As for the second one, I'm starting with a mix of medium yellow with a bit of white. Then I'm going to add a bit of yellow ochre on the side mixed with the Prussian blue and the ochre that I already had on my palette to create a dark yellow ochre mix. And I'm just going to basically alternate between the two color mixtures by playing around with the ratio as well. For the next oak tree leaf, I'm going to use ochre with a bit of white and Ponceau, and I'm going to mix this into the yellow ochre. Sorry, I've been saying it wrong this whole time, it's earth yellow, but basically I'm just using this mixture and alternating it with a bit of medium yellow and white mixed into the previous mixture. And as you can see, some of the color mixtures are just too complicated. That's because I'm using the previous color mixtures that I already had on my palette mixed with other colors that I've already mixed together. But what I'm doing here is showing you how I mix my colors. You don't have to make the exact same color mixtures, but I'm giving you the option to. I just want to show you that as a possibility to use the color mixtures that you've already had on your palette and add on to it to create other tones if you find that it's visually pleasing. This is also why I didn't end up needing as much paint as I thought, because I tend to just recycle the colors that I already had on my palette. Like this one, I'm using the ochre that I already had hints of other colors, but because ochre is still the dominant color, I can turn it into this muted orange by adding more medium yellow. I feel like I'm done with the browns and the oranges for now, so I'm going to mix an earthy green instead by using Jade Green with earth yellow and a bit of white. The color that I'm going for is this earthy yellow-green color, which I use to paint the edges since I want the edges to be a little bit jagged and sharp. Then I'm going to pair this color with the medium yellow mixed with ochre. And I know that this has other colors as well, but those are the dominant colors that I'm going to pair up with the earthy yellow-green. I'm also going to use the same colors for this next leaf. Now moving along, I'm still using the same color mixture, but this time I added more Jade Green, which is why the color or the green is a little bit cooler, and I also added a bit of white. Along the edges, I like to add a bit more Jade Green for a slightly darker value, and just like the previous leaves, I'm also going to play around with the ratio of the earth yellow and the white. It's okay if some of the leaves are a bit lighter and some are darker. In fact, I actually prefer it to be that way. Moving along, I'm still going to use the exact same color mixture, but this time I added more white and earth yellow in the ratio. As you might also notice, I haven't been painting any of the stems, just the leaves, because I'm going to add the stems and the details of the leaves using my colored pencils. Now on to the next one. I started by using a mix of medium yellow, white, and a little bit of ochre for the base color, and I decided to pair this up with a mix of ochre, Prussian blue, and a bit of white for this warm gray tone. Next, I'm going to paint the single leaf, and I'm going to treat it the same way as the same type of leaves that I painted earlier. So those are basically the color mixtures that I'm going to use for the leaves. You're free to create other color mixtures if you would like to, but I'm just going to continue using the colors that I already mixed on my palette to paint the other leaves as well. By the way, if you want to paint this using watercolors, instead of applying the different tones the way I've shown you, you can use the wet on wet technique, which will help make the colors blend naturally together through the wet paint. The reason why I'm using gouache here is because I'm using my sketchbook, which has damaged paper. So if I were to use watercolors for this painting, a lot of the colors tend to want to bleed out of the line depending on how damaged the area of the paper is. So I just felt like avoiding that with this painting. And if you're interested in seeing how I paint these types of doodles with watercolors, I do have older videos on a similar subject matter, or you can also take the Skillshare class that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, where I'll be doodling similar types of leaves plus mushrooms and flowers with watercolors, which is a fun project for all levels. But now, getting back to the painting, I'm going to paint on the berries using a mix of Ponceau as the main red, and I also mixed it with a bit of Ochre and Prussian Blue to deepen and make the red a bit more rich. In terms of the application, you can see that I left out a bit of white negative space for the highlights, but it's not exactly necessary because sometimes I forget when I'm painting with gouache, you can just paint the white highlights on top anyway. I think I'm pretty much done with all of the leaves here, so next I'm going to paint on the flowers and the flower petals. I want the colors to be very light and creamy because I want them to look like they're dried. So for this first one, I used earth yellow with white, and I added a little bit of the dark brown mix that I already had on my palette just to mute the color a bit more. Then I follow this up to paint the sepals underneath with the green that I already had on my palette. Now for the rest of the hydrangea flowers, I'm just going to use any of the browns that I already had on my palette and just add more white to it to create a lighter color, and I'm going to play around with the different tones of brown, so all of these flower petals have a slight difference in tone. And as for the tips and the center of the flower, I just use a darker value of the same tone with less white. After I've painted everything that I've drawn out, I'm going to go back in to fill in some of the empty spaces using the elements that I've already painted. So as an example here, I'm painting the berries, and to fill in this tiny spot, I decided to add a small hydrangea flower. Since the highlights that I left out for these berries were a bit too small, I decided to add more with white. Next, I'm going to erase the unnecessary pencil marks that I didn't paint over, just to neaten the outline, but I'm still going to leave the lines for the stems. After that, I'm going to draw out the details of the leaves as well as the stems using my colored pencils. As I've shown you earlier, I'll be using 3 colors for this, but you can use more colors if you have some which will work well with your painting. I prefer for my pencils to be nice and sharp so the lines can be very neat and clean. Using the 3 colors that I've chosen, I like to pick ones which I feel would fit the color of the leaves. And for the larger leaves, I like to add the main stem, which connects to the midrib of the leaves. Then I also add on the veins in quite a detailed manner, since the colored pencils actually show up pretty well on top of the gouache. So even if I add thinner lines, you can still see them quite well. For the smaller leaves, however, I'm not going to make the veins too detailed because too much detail might also get lost in the composition, especially when you're adding on details to smaller areas. For the hydrangea flowers, I'm going to add really fine lines as the veins of the flower petals. I want this to be subtle enough so it looks a bit more like texture instead of details, so the shape of the petals doesn't look too flat. And since the flowers are generally quite light in color, I also like to add a bit of outline using my colored pencils. I like to also vary the pressure as I'm adding on the outline so it doesn't look even all throughout. For the veins of the flower petals, I like to add lines very subtly from the center outwards, and I also like to darken the center of the flowers with the brown or the dark brown colored pencils so the center looks a bit deeper. Here I decided to make the strokes a bit different for the larger leaf, so I want the midrib and the main veins to be quite thick, so I added a bit more pressure when I'm drawing it on, and as for the finer details, I didn't put as much pressure, so those lines are lighter and more subtle. I ended up liking the way this looks, so I'm going to actually apply this method to the rest of the larger leaves, including the ones that I've already drawn out the details of by just going over the main midrib and the veins again to make them slightly thicker and darker. I also decided to add some outlines to parts of the edges of some of the leaves. I find that this makes the composition look a bit more dynamic. I'm not going to overdo this though, and I'm only going to do this for some areas of the leaves. But if you would like to, you can actually intentionally make slightly messy outlines to the leaves to give the doodle a different feel, something that's a bit more dynamic in general. It'll also work, so just have fun with it and doodle whatever you feel like doodling. After adding on the details and the outlines, I had a look at the whole composition again, and I decided to fill in more of the smaller spaces. I decided to add some pine needles since they're really easy to paint. I just used a mix of Prussian blue with earth yellow and a touch of ochre to paint on the lines fanning outwards, and I follow it up with my dark brown pencil for the stem. I also decided to add a small flower and some leaves using the color mixtures that I already have on my palette just to fill in the rest of the space, and I'm just going to continue to add those tiny little fillers.
Lastly, I'm just going to add a couple of smaller leaves, and that's basically it for this doodle. I really enjoyed painting these leaves using gouache, and don't forget, if you're interested in the watercolor version of a fuller autumn doodle, you can join me on my Skillshare class. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more content like this, please feel free to subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified of my new coming tutorials. Like usual, all the list of tools that I used here as well as my social media links will be in my description box. The outline will also be available in my coffee shop. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!